What is up, YouTube? I'm gonna jump right in today. Before I jump into this lesson, it is action-packed. I'm not even gonna go over all the exercises I have for this stuff. You'll want to download the sheet music in the description below. It has a ton of exercises. All of this stuff will make way more sense if you can see it on paper, even if you can't read music. I suggest you download the sheet music because it will make your life much easier. This lesson is going to be action-packed, but it's about something called implied metric modulation. A lot of people sometimes just refer to this as metric modulation. I'm not going to get into the details and the nitty-gritty about what the difference is or whatever, but basically, I thought about implied metric modulation recently because I was transcribing the newest VF Jams Live, or at the time I'm filming this, the newest VF Jams Live, from Vic Firth, and Mike Mitchell was playing drums, and there's a section of the song where he starts implying a new tempo when really he's just playing stuff based off the quarter note triplets. Implied metric modulation is essentially just that. You are playing vocabulary on the drums that makes it feel like you're going to a new tempo. When you're staying at the exact same tempo, all of your ideas are based on another subdivision. That's an oversimplification, but I have a lot of stuff to get through and I don't want to. There are a ton of places that explain way better what implied metric modulation is, so you can just Google it, but let's get into all these exercises. So before you actually start playing implied metric modulation ideas, it's really useful to get used to the base of starting to feel these other times as their own thing. This first exercise, you're going to play a measure of eighth note triplets for one measure. And then the second measure, you're going to accent every other eighth note. So there's going to be an accented note, and then a ghost note, an accented note, and a ghost note. So with 4 beats of eighth note triplets, that gives us 6 accents within the measure. What you're doing by adding these accents is you're implying the quarter note triplet. And that's exactly what the third measure does. When you take away those ghost notes, you're left with the quarter note triplet. And that's the first line. You have 2 other lines that all start accents on different patterns and set up the quarter note triplet to begin either on the first partial of the triplet, the second partial of the triplet, or the third partial of the triplet. I think you'll get it when you hear it. So here's the exercise at 60 beats a minute. So when you start hearing it, it makes a little more sense. Those accent patterns become a new kind of time feel when you remove those ghost notes. And that's really what we're after. That exercise, if you play through it and get comfortable hearing the accents happening every other eighth note, no matter where you start it, and then you get comfortable with those last measures where you remove the ghost notes, you're going to start feeling triplet time. You're going to start feeling implied quarter note triplet as the new quarter note time. All of that stuff will start happening if you get used to this exercise and really start to get it into your bones, get it into your playing. Practice it every day, once a day for a little bit. And I promise that this will get you feeling implied time a little bit better. Let's move to the second exercise, which is still a preliminary exercise getting us ready for these grooves and fills we're about to learn toward that back of the lesson. All right, so the second preliminary exercise is going to be 16th note triplets. And what we're going to do is we're going to have a group of 16th note triplets, and then a group of 16th note triplets where we're accenting every 4. And then we're going to remove those ghosted notes, and we're going to be left again with quarter note triplets. And as you can see, when I play through these exercises and I remove the ghost notes, it can sometimes be helpful to leave the ghosting hand moving even though you're not playing the snare drum. I don't always do that because at this point I'm really familiar with these rhythms, but that can help you get used to this stuff. These two preliminary exercises are really going to help this make a lot more sense when you start to play these other grooves and stuff. If you can get used to jumping between triplets and then quarter note triplets and then starting the quarter note triplet on the second partial of the triplet and the third partial, all that stuff, if you get comfortable with that, these grooves and these fills we're about to go through are going to be much easier. So in Implied Metric Modulation, we have a couple of grooves that I want to go over that are really cool and that just kind of get a cool, interesting feel going on. So this first one, you'll see there's a measure that is repeated that's just a regular groove, kick on 1 and 3, snare on 2 and 4, super easy. And then the second measure you'll see is based off of eighth note triplets. And you're playing that same groove, kick drum, hi-hat by itself, snare drum, hi-hat by itself, but now in eighth note triplets. So it starts to feel like we move to a new tempo because you're playing for every 4 groups of triplets, you're really playing 6 kick and backbeats. Kick, snare, kick, snare, kick, snare across the triplets, which starts to feel really cool. And again, all we're doing is playing eighth note triplets and then throwing the kick and the snare in a spot where it's not natural for the triplets, it's really natural for whatever tempo we were just at. But now that we're playing it in triplets, it's starting to feel like a new time, kind of crazy. So this is how it sounds. That is super fun, and it might take a second for that to settle in, and you really want to make sure that you're not accenting the downbeats of the triplets, you're accenting the kick drum and the snare drum. That 2-note grouping feel is really going to be key, that you have those be the accents, not accenting every triplet, because if you accent every triplet, it doesn't sound like we moved to a new time signature. It doesn't imply that we move to a new time signature. It implies that you're accenting the triplet every 2 notes, which is technically what you're doing, but you want it to feel like we're going to a different tempo. All right, so the next exercise is kind of the same thing, except instead of eighth note triplets, we're going to go do quarter note triplets. So we're going to have 2 measures repeated of regular, normal eighth notes on hi-hat, kick drum 1 and 3, snare drum 2 and 4, and then we're going to move to 2 measures of quarter note triplets because it takes 2 measures for this to turn around. You have the kick drum on the first quarter note triplet, hi-hat by itself on the second quarter note triplet, snare drum and hi-hat on the third quarter note triplet, hi-hat by itself on the first quarter note triplet of the second quarter note triplet in the measure. You just look at the sheet music. It takes 2 measures for these quarter note triplets to turn the groove back around so we can come back to the downbeat of the tempo we're actually at. So here's what this sounds like. I know that all sounds crazy. And you might be saying at this point, what's the point of this? I don't totally fully understand this, and that's totally fine. I'm breezing through this stuff really quickly, but now is a good time to talk maybe about why you would ever do this. And I think that implied metric modulation is useful if you're ready for it and if the people you're playing music with are ready for it. If you've never really messed with implied metric modulation and neither of your bandmates, this is not a good idea to break this out, even if you practice this stuff. if you're not comfortable at really feeling this stuff, if you're having to read this stuff, you should never break it out on a gig. It's just not gonna fit right. It's not gonna feel genuine. But again, you might still be wondering, like, when would I ever even use this, even if I knew how to do it and my bandmates knew how to do it? And that's a good question. Probably not that often, unless you're in a band that specifically does stuff like this. Really, I think the most useful times where implied metric modulation comes are, one, in a solo or like a section where you're trying to show off, and you do it as kind of a crazy look at me moment. I think that that's an appropriate time to do metric modulation. And I also think that there are certain songs that the phrases that either the melody or the guitar riff or whatever, there are certain phrases within actual music that kind of imply a new tempo or imply a hemiola or whatever. And I think that those are the times where usually in pop music, it's only going to be for one measure that it does it, and then it comes down on the downbeat. They either chop off the end of the implied metric modulation so that they make it even and it lines up with the measure or whatever. It never gets too crazy, too confusing. But as a drummer, if you take that first measure that they're implying that new time and then you just run with it, that's a time where the music set it up and then you just took it further than it would usually go. I think that's something that's appropriate. But again, all this stuff is really, you really need to exercise good musical judgment with this stuff. And I'll also add that, well, yes, maybe you can find times where you can play this stuff musically and it's cool, whatever. I also think it's just good to work on this stuff, because if you can get good at feeling a new tempo but staying at the old tempo and all that stuff is really working on your timing in a huge way, which is always going to pay off. We're always going to need to have better sense of time. So I think it's always worthwhile to pursue stuff like this. Even if we don't break it out on a gig, it's strengthening our timing. The last two exercises. Both of these fills are very, very easy. It's just taking 8th note triplets and accenting every 4 notes, or taking 16th note triplets and accenting every 4 notes. So these aren't necessarily totally implied metric modulation. They could be if you started to get crazier with how you broke it up and whatever. But these are just kind of cool ways to think about 8th note triplets and 16th note triplets that maybe not necessarily exactly with these orchestrations, but you can use this to start going somewhere if you really wanted to. So here's the 8th note triplet fill. With 8th note triplets accenting every 4, you're almost kind of implying like a half note triplet feel. But it feels really cool. I think that it feels very different to accent every 4 8th note triplets than every 2, or, accenting every 3 triplets, which is right on the beat. Accenting every 4 gives a very cool feel. So this is what that sounds like. For the 16th note triplet, also really cool. Again, not necessarily totally implied metric modulation here. It's just kind of breaking up 16th note triplets in groups of 4, and that's just not how we would typically hear it, but here's what that sounds like. I know, I crammed a lot into this lesson. I might have to go back. If you want more implied metric modulation stuff, you want more in-depth explanation or whatever, put it down in the comments. I might do it, but you guys might hate this, and if so, I won't do this again. But I have fun with this stuff, and I think you will too. Again, download the sheet music in the description. It's going to make all this make a lot more sense. And if you like this stuff, subscribe to the channel. Leave me a comment, hit subscribe, hit the notification bell, and I'll see you in the next lesson.